Your chest is already tight before you open your mouth. The crush of bodies squeezes the air from your lungs, their heat mixing with the cold bite of morning fog. Somewhere above the heads, the rope swings slow and heavy, the mist licking its coarse fibers. The smell hits next wet stone, sour ale, unwashed wool, and something sharp from the butcher's stall that makes your teeth ache. A woman's voice cuts through the din to your right, selling pies with a pitch high enough to pierce the noise. To your left, the butcher hawks slabs of meat between gulps of beer. You pitch your own voice into the chaos, forcing it sharp and bright. Under your coat, the fresh inked stack of broadsides presses into your ribs. Still warm, still bleeding, the metallic tang of the press. Each sheet is survival. Bread, rent, a night without hunger. You launch into the last dying speech and confession of William Carter, the words honed from years of shouting against wind and market noise. Faces turn toward you, apprentice boys, in patched caps, chimney maids, dusted in soot, even a gentleman with a silver-topped cane. Coins shift in pockets, hands hover near purses. The scaffold groans. The hangman steps forward, collar crooked, eyes narrowed against the mist. The condemned emerges pale as bone, wrists bound, shirt collar open to the throat. You match your chorus to the crowd's rising tension, letting the rhythm build step for step. Then it changes. A tremor in the front rows shivers through the crowd like frost creeping over glass. The prisoner stops mid-step. The hangman freezes. Guards murmur, in short, hard words. Fists tight on halberds. "The king's pardon's here," a boy shouts. "No, his brother's here with a knife." Another snaps back. The square erupts. Shouts and shoves slam you forward. The weight of the mob grinds your ballads into damp pulp under boots. If it's a pardon, your stock dies in your hands. If it's a rescue, you could sell every sheet for twice the price if the crush doesn't kill you first. In the Georgian streets, a ballad seller was equal parts merchant, performer, and survivor. You lived in the cracks, between the city's noise and its hunger, feeding both. Some days you were a tradesman with a pocket full of coins, others a beggar with a fistful of unsold sheets. You were part of a centuries-old tradition that wound through the markets and execution grounds like smoke. Your work was to turn death into paper, paper into song, and song into pennies. The job was never respectable. Gentlemen saw you as a nuisance, clogging the courts and prison gates with your cries. Magistrates saw you as a risk, a possible spreader of sedition if your verses wandered too far into sympathy for the condemned. Yet for all their disdain, they knew you had a place. The gallows drew thousands, and the crowd came hungry for more than just the sight of justice. They wanted the story, the scandal, the warning, the neatly packaged fall from grace, and you sold it to them before the body swung. You worked closely with the printers, those dim, smoky shops where presses pounded out the words that kept you fed. The text might be scrawled in haste from the trial's notes, or simply invented whole cloth to suit the public mood. A good printer knew what sold more blood, more betrayal, more begging for God's mercy at the end. Woodcut illustrations, crude and black with ink, framed the tale, the doomed man in chains, the noose overhead, perhaps a weeping mother in the corner. On execution mornings you collected your stack, often still damp from the press, and hurried to claim your patch of ground before the other sellers crowded you out. Competition was fierce. The best spots were near the scaffold, but not so close that the guards shoved you back. You needed to be seen, heard, and have room for buyers to press coins into your hand without losing them in the mob. The money was never steady. On a good day, you might go home with enough for a warm supper and a pint. On a bad one, you came back with wet sheets, trampled by boots, the words smeared into unreadable blots. Yet the trade had its own kind of pride. You knew the cadences that made a crowd hush, the rhymes that lingered in their minds as they trudged home. For the price of a loaf, you gave them the comfort of a neat ending to a messy life, and when the last sheet was gone, You melted into the alleys, another face in the city that fed on stories of death. An execution day in Georgian London was theatre without curtains. The city awoke earlier than usual, its cobbled veins thrumming with footsteps long before the sun cleared the rooftops. Hawkers trundled carts of ale and pies. Pickpockets threaded the growing tide like fish through reeds. Apprentices abandoned their workbenches. Servants claimed they were running errands. By mid-morning, the streets leading to Newgate were swollen with every sort of person, each drawn by the same morbid pull. The scaffold dominated the square, its timber dark with rain and older stains. A black draped cart waited nearby, holding the condemned. Guards in heavy coats kept a loose cordon, more concerned with keeping the crowd back than keeping order. There was no order to be had here. You worked the edges at first, pacing the slushy mud to call out your wares. The trick was to find a pocket of listeners, a group willing to linger on your verses rather than push past for a better view. When you found one, you planted your feet, voice rising over the clatter of mugs and the bray of competing sellers. Every song you shouted into the cold was a fishing line, and every coin in your palm was a catch pulled from the churning human sea. Near the scaffold, the atmosphere changed. The noise thinned, not into silence, but into something taut and waiting. Faces tilted toward the platform. People jostled for the right to see another man's last breath. For those who couldn't push forward, you were the next best thing. Your ballad a painted image in sound. You gave them the crime, the trial, the repentance, all wrapped in rhyme and ready to be tucked into a pocket. The smells were overwhelming, ale sloshing from tin mugs, freshly baked pies cooling too fast in the winter air, the acrid smoke from cheap tobacco. Beneath it all, the damp reek of wool soaked in rain and sweat. The wooden boards of the scaffold creaked when someone stepped on them, and that sound travelled like a rumour through the massed bodies. You had to be careful. A shove from behind could send your stack of sheets into the mud. A sudden brawl between drunkards could spill your buyers like startled birds. Worse, an officer might decide your verses were too sympathetic and drag you away. But these risks were the price of working the stage. Here, in the shadow of the gallows, was where your day's fortune was made or lost. One good performance could empty your hands before the trapdoor fell. One bad one, and you would stand watching the crowd drift away with your livelihood still clutched to your chest. Your trade was ink and paper, but not the fine kind found in drawing rooms or university halls. These were broadsides, single sheets of coarse, fibrous stock, rough under the fingers and quick to soak in the thick black of the press. Each one carried a headline long enough to tell the whole story at a glance. The last dying speech and confession of Jonathan Hale, executed at Newgate for the murder of his master. No one could mistake the purpose. The words were blunt but dressed in rhythm, built to be sung or shouted. A ballad was a performance script disguised as a moral lesson. Verse after verse led the listener from a reckless youth to a sinful crime, then through the arrest, the trial, the moments of regret, and finally, the scaffold. Always there was a plea to live uprightly, a warning to avoid drink, vice, or bad company. Whether any of it came from the condemned's mouth was beside the point. A printer might hear 2 lines in the courtroom and invent the rest before his ink dried. Illustrations sold as much as the words. Crude woodcuts, carved in haste and reused from older executions, framed the text. A man in shackles, a rope dangling above a crowd. Sometimes the likeness bore no resemblance to the criminal in question, but no one cared. Buyers wanted the symbol, not the truth. The speed of production was everything. The trial might end only the day before the execution. Printers worked through the night, setting type by lamplight, the press squealing with each sheet pulled. You arrived in the early hours to collect your stack, the ink still smudging if handled too roughly. The pages were still damp against your chest as you hurried to your pitch. You knew which details to emphasize. If the condemned had been handsome, you mentioned it early. If the crime was bloody, you drew it out in verse. A wealthy victim gave the ballad more bite. A confession to God in the final stanza sealed it with a kind of grim respectability. The price was low, a penny or two, but the margin was yours, if you could sell enough. That meant performance. You had to sing with a rhythm that carried over the crowd, to make each line hook the ear even as the listener's eyes darted toward the scaffold. The sheet was a keepsake, but your voice was the lure. A good ballad, sold well, could pay your rent for the week. A poor one might leave you with nothing but damp paper and the smell of ink on your fingers. Selling ballads was never just about handing over paper. It was theatre in the raw, and you were both actor and stagehand. The first note you sang had to slice through the chaos like a blade, because if you lost the crowd in those opening moments, they would drift toward the man flogging sausages or the fiddler in the corner. Your voice was your trade, worn rough from years of shouting in rain and wind. You began with the headline verse, a sharp, rhyming hook that told them who, what, and why. Faces turned. A maid clutched her basket tighter, leaning in to hear the details. An apprentice wiped his hands on his apron and edged closer. Once you had them, you let the rhythm carry them along. The beat of your lines matched the sway of the crowd, timed to the shifting attention that always moved between you and the scaffold. Some sellers chanted in a flat, relentless tone, rattling through the verses like a drumbeat. Others, the better ones, wove drama into each stanza, slowing their delivery before the fall of the rope, raising their pitch when recounting the crime, dropping to a hush for the prisoner's final prayer. You had learned that trick early, watching the way a whisper could pull more heads closer than a shout. Performance was also about reading your audience. A crowd heavy with young men wanted the blood and scandal brought forward early. Groups of servants responded to moral warnings, nodding along as you sang about wicked companions and the wages of sin. A cluster of well-dressed onlookers liked the theatrical formality, the rise and fall of your voice like a preacher's, the grim dignity of the final lines. You moved constantly, sidestepping to open a path for buyers, pivoting to keep your voice toward the densest clusters. Coins slid into your palm, sometimes with a muttered thanks, sometimes with no more than a grunt. You kept the sheets dry under your arm, feeding them out one by one, folding them quickly to keep the ink from smearing. There were dangers in performance too. Sing too loudly, and a rival might shout over you, twisting your verses into mockery. Get too close to the scaffold and the guards would shove you back, scattering your customers. Misjudge the mood of the crowd and you could find yourself jeered at, or worse, shoved into the mud. But when you found the right rhythm, the right pitch, the right story, the effect was electric. For a few minutes, you held more attention than the gallows itself. Your buyers were as varied as the cobblestones under your feet. Apprentices fresh from the workshop, their fingers still smelling of pitch or iron, were among your most reliable customers. They handed over their penny, as if buying a piece of the day's drama to carry back to their fellows. Housemaids came in pairs, cheeks flushed from the cold, whispering behind their mittens as they clutched a single sheet between them. Even soldiers on leave, boots caked with mud from some far-flung posting, liked to have a ballad in their pocket, a souvenir of London's darker entertainments. Then there were the gentry, who arrived in their carriages, stepping down into the muck, for no other reason than to see a life end. Some bought a sheet with a half-smile, treating it as an oddity to be shown later over wine. They rarely stayed for your song, preferring instead to let the paper speak for itself once they were safely away from the crush. Children darted between legs, sometimes buying, sometimes stealing. A quick-fingered boy could snatch a ballad and vanish before you had time to curse. You learned to grip your stack tighter when they came too close. There were also the regulars' faces you saw at every execution who collected your sheets like trophies, pasting them to alehouse walls or keeping them folded in boxes alongside other tokens of the scaffold. Motives varied. Some came for the moral, genuinely stirred by the verses warning against drink, gambling, or crime. Others sought the thrill, hungry for the sordid details no church sermon would provide. A few wanted to remember the condemned, a friend, a lover, a neighbor, and took the sheet home as if it were a funeral card. Crowd mood could shift in a heartbeat. On some days it was boisterous, the air thick with jeers and laughter. Other days it turned grim, the only sound your own voice as the condemned prayed aloud. You learned to adjust to both, softening your tone when the mood was somber, or leaning into the blood and scandal when the crowd was restless. What united them was the appetite for story. They wanted their execution like a play, beginning, middle, and end, tied up in rhyme and ink. You gave it to them, and in doing so, you became part of the ritual. Without the crowd, there was no sale. Without you, there was no souvenir. In that uneasy partnership between spectacle and seller, both sides got what they came for at least, until the rope tightened and the day's entertainment was over. The gallows might have been the condemned man's stage, but the crowd was your battlefield. Every step you took risked a shove, a pickpocket, or worse. On a wet day, the mud could pull a boot clean off your foot, leaving you scrambling to keep your balance with your stack of ballads clutched high. On a dry one, the dust kicked up from hundreds of feet could choke your throat before the first verse was finished. Pickpockets prowled with practiced ease, their eyes darting to your coin hand. You learned to keep your earnings separate from the change you handed out, tucking the day's take deep into your coat lining. But even caution wasn't always enough. A sudden push from behind, a feigned stumble from a stranger, and your pocket would be lighter before you knew it. Drunken hecklers were worse. They would shout over your verses, twisting your lines into crude jokes, mocking the condemned or you. If they were in numbers, they might jostle you until your sheets fell, trampled underfoot before you could stoop to save them. More than once, sellers had been punched or kicked for refusing to hand over a ballad without payment. Then there were the watchmen and constables. Their job, at least on paper, was to keep order. But if your verses were judged too sympathetic to the condemned or too critical of the authorities, they could haul you off. Some magistrates believed ballads stirred unrest, that your rhymes might spark pity where there ought to be fear. A night in the lockup for disturbing the peace could undo a week's earnings. Rival sellers could be nearly as dangerous. The best patches near the scaffold were fought over with elbows and curses. If you arrived late, you might find yourself boxed into a corner where no one could hear you. Some competitors would mimic your melody to confuse the crowd, or even start selling their own sheets claiming they were the true version of the condemned speech. And always, there was the crowd itself, a living, shifting force. If the execution turned chaotic, if the condemned resisted, or a rumor of pardon spread, that living wall of bodies could turn into a crush with lethal force. You had to keep one eye on your buyers and one on your escape route, ready to melt into an alley before the scaffold became a riot. Each sale was a gamble. The same press of bodies that brought you customers could swallow you whole. Every coin earned was pulled from the teeth of danger, and you learned to count them quickly before the next risk came at you from the side. An execution was as much about the talking as the hanging. From the moment the condemned's name hit the street, whispers sprouted like weeds. You learned to listen, to catch the juiciest bits and thread them into your verses before ink ever touched paper. Sometimes, the details came from a court clerk willing to talk for the price of a pint. Other times it was a jailer's boy with wide eyes and a loose tongue, eager to tell you what he'd overheard in the cells. Rumor could make or break your day's sales. A tale of betrayal by a close friend, a hidden fortune buried before arrest, or a supposed last-minute confession to a second, more terrible crime. These were the stories that made the crowd press coins into your hand before the trapdoor fell. Accuracy mattered far less than drama. If the condemned denied every word, the crowd would decide for themselves which story to believe. But gossip could be dangerous too. Speak too freely against the wrong person, and you risked more than the constable's glare. A ballad that hinted at corruption among magistrates or the wealthy could draw the wrong kind of attention. A whisper that the condemned was framed might stir sympathy where the authorities wanted none. and you could find yourself accused of sedition. Some sellers work both sides. The authorities sometimes paid to have certain verses printed lines that emphasized the guilt, the justice of the sentence, the repentance at the end. It kept the moral clear and the public sentiment tidy. But others thrived on the mess, knowing that a whiff of scandal made for better sales. You had to decide which you were, and live with the risk. The crowd fed on gossip like birds on grain. As you sang, you could see them leaning toward each other, repeating lines from your ballad as if they'd witnessed the events themselves. A few would add their own embellishments before the words reached the next listener. By day's end, the story you'd sold might bear little resemblance to the one you'd printed, yet it would be carried into taverns, kitchens, and workshops across the city. You learned to treat gossip like a tool sharpened when you needed to cut through the noise, dulled when you didn't want it turning back on you. In the end, it was just another currency in the trade, as valuable as the coins that clinked in your pocket. And like any currency, it could bankrupt you as quickly as it could make you rich. By the late Georgian years, the rhythm of your trade began to falter. The crowds were still there, but the mood was shifting. The old Tyburn route had been abandoned decades before, and now most executions took place within the walls of Newgate or in smaller, more controlled spaces. The spectacle was shrinking, fenced off from the open streets where a seller could work freely. Newspapers were rising fast. For a penny, readers could get not just the execution story, but politics, scandal, and theatre reviews. They offered detail in neat columns, unruffled by the shouts and smells of the scaffold yard. Printers who once relied on sellers like you began to court newspaper contracts instead. Broadsides were still printed, but the urgency was gone. By the time you sang your first verse, the story might already be in print for anyone with a subscription. Literacy was spreading too, where once you could sell to people who wanted the story read or sung aloud, more and more customers could take in the words themselves. The performance mattered less when the listener could simply buy the paper and walk away. Some even preferred the printed sheet without your voice coloring the tale. The authorities were also growing wary of the carnival atmosphere. They spoke of moral order, of not encouraging depraved excitement around executions. Some pushed for hangings to take place at dawn, before most of the city could arrive. Others pressed to move them entirely behind prison walls, leaving only the official printed account as public record. For a ballad seller, it was a slow strangling. You tried to adapt. Some sellers followed the crowds to public floggings or notorious trials, hawking fresh sheets about crimes that hadn't yet reached the scaffold. Others shifted to general crime ballads, broad enough to sell in markets without tying them to a single event. A few left the trade altogether, moving into street theatre, tavern singing, or selling other printed goods. But the heyday was ending. The gallows had been your stage, the crowd your captive audience, and the condemned your unwilling lead actor. Without them in plain view, the energy drained away. A sheet sold in a quiet market never rang in the palm like one sold with the scaffold looming at your back. You could feel the trade slipping into history, even as you kept singing in the hope that someone, somewhere, still wanted to buy death set to rhyme. When the scaffold doors finally shut to the public, it did not erase the voices that had carried its stories. Your trade, worn thin by law and competition, did not vanish so much as dissolve into other forms. The skill of holding a crowd's attention, the rise and fall of your voice, the shaping of a story to suit your listener found new corners to live in. Some former sellers became theatre barkers, calling in customers to cheap shows that promised sword fights and romances. Others wandered into the growing world of political pamphleteering, where a sharp rhyme could still stir the blood. The ballads themselves did not die. They found new homes on alehouse walls, in sailors' chests, in the pages of collectors' books. Some were read as quaint moral relics. Others became evidence in studies of crime and justice, quoted by gentlemen who had never stood ankle-deep in Newgate's mud. The old woodcuts, chipped and smudged, turned into curiosities in market stalls, selling for more than you once made in a week. In a way, your trade was simply part of a longer line. the telling of crime as entertainment. The same hunger that had drawn thousands to the gallows now bought serialized stories in newspapers, penny dreadfuls, and later, illustrated weeklies. People still wanted their villains and their punishments, still wanted to feel the shiver of danger at a safe distance. Only the stage had changed. You sometimes wondered what became of the lives you sang about. Did the condemned who repented in your verses really find peace before the drop? Did the guilty ever hear their own ballads in the street? These questions mattered less to the buyers than the neatness of the ending, the way the rhyme smoothed out the mess of a real life. And perhaps that was the truest legacy of your work. You were not in the business of truth, not entirely. You were in the business of memory, and memory is always shaped by the one who tells it. In your time, you sold death for a penny, wrapped in rhyme and ink. Centuries later, the appetite for such stories remains. They are told in other voices, printed on other paper, but the bargain is the same, a coin for a taste of someone else's fate. Step back from the scaffold yard now. The crowd thins, their boots leaving dark prints in the churned mud. Somewhere, a pie seller counts her coins, a fiddler packs his bow. The gallows stands empty against the damp sky, the rope swaying like a slow heartbeat before the wind stills it. You have only a few sheets left, the ink smudged at the edges from cold hands and hurried exchanges. They will sell before dusk, perhaps in a tavern doorway, perhaps to a maid on her way home. Years from now, no one will remember your face. They might remember a line from one of your verses, though they won't know who sang it. They might recall an old woodcut tacked to a pub wall, the black lines faded to grey, the figure beneath the noose still caught in his last moment. They might hold a fragile broadside in an archive, reading the words in silence where once they were shouted over the roar of 1,000 voices. This was your craft, to take the rough edges of a life's end and sand them smooth with rhyme, to turn fear and scandal into something that could be folded and carried away. It was never noble work, nor safe, nor entirely honest, but it was the work of memory, and memory is what the crowd came for as much as the spectacle. The ink has dried now, but the trade's ghost lingers in every retelling of crime and punishment, in every headline shaped to draw the eye, in every voice that rises above the din to tell a story worth paying for. The scaffold is gone, the sellers long vanished, yet the bargain remains. A coin, a sheet, a story you can keep. You've stood in the yard, watched the crowd thin, and seen the ink dry. That makes you a witness now, same as those who paid their penny. Tell me what you would have done, bought the song, or turned away. If you'd like to stand witness to more tales history tried to bury, show your support with a like, subscribe to the channel, and keep your place at the front of the crowd.